Welcome to the Bridging Broken to Breakthrough podcast. I am your host, Maria Wingard. Today is a red tent conversation. It's those, hey, can we grab a cup of coffee or tea conversations leading to the passing of truths from one generation to the next through lived experiences. I chose red tent specifically to counter the radical feminist infiltration into Christianity with its lies. Lies about who we are as women. Lies about how God created and designed us to be inside of society and our homes. So, welcome to my red tent. Today's episode is Interview with a Vampire, Redeemed by Jesus, Part 1. I will introduce you to my friend Dorothy, whom I've known for quite a while. I've had the privilege to walk with her through much of her coming back to Jesus process. Dorothy had a Damascus Road experience where the Lord radically encountered her in her home. So she gave her life back to him and walked away from a life steeped in the occult and witchcraft. Today's episode is going to focus on her childhood and how she was introduced to the occult. So without further ado, Interview with a Vampire, Redeemed by Jesus. Today's guest is Dorothy. We are going to withhold her last name for privacy, as well as the fact that we are not doing video for that reason. Today, Dorothy is on here as my guest in order to talk about what it's like to come out of the occult world. She's going to give her testimony. She's going to talk about what the occult world, witchcraft world looked like, talk about her conversion into Christianity and what that journey looked like up to today. So, Dorothy, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm so glad you decided to do this. I think it's going to be very helpful for people. So I truly appreciate your transparency on some very touchy subjects.
Yes. And I believe that this is going to be very educational because a lot of people, especially Christians, don't realize how this world has infiltrated into just about everything in our daily lives.
I agree. So let's start with your testimony.
Okay.
Tell me about your childhood. Obviously I know all these things, but tell our guests in an outline form, kind of your testimony, your background.
Okay. So I'm going to give the brief condensed version of it. And basically my father and mother, well, I don't know if I should go into my mother, especially the world that she was in, but there was a lot of sexual promiscuity in that world. My father met up with her. I came into the world shortly after, and there was a lot of abuse growing up from both sides, both my mom and my dad. So I had a lot of abuse, every kind of abuse you can think of, mental, emotional, physical, and sexual. I've always known that God existed for some reason. My mother, she was a Catholic that turned to Buddhist. My father was agnostic, so he didn't claim that there was no God, but he didn't really support any sort of higher being either. But anyway, since childhood, I've always known that there was a God. I always knew about Jesus for some reason, and I can't even explain that. And I do feel in my soul that God was looking after me even as a child, going through a lot of the trauma and things that I was going through. But specifically, we're talking about the occult world. Mm-hmm. So as a child, I did attend church. I did not go with my parents initially. My mother had a salon, and there was a pastor's wife who booked an appointment, and I helped in the shop as a child. And she asked my mother if she could take me to church. And my mother was very hesitant about it, but I really wanted to go because I loved attending church. So she would actually pick me up on Sunday mornings, and I was in her Sunday school class. I eventually, after about 3 years of going to church by myself, I begged and begged and begged my parents to come, and they did. Mm-hmm. By the time I was 11, they started going, And within 6 months, my dad ended up being a Sunday school teacher. My mom got saved. My dad got saved. Hallelujah. But they used God against me, if that makes any
Hmm.
sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so here I was, like, I was a very, and I can tell you that I was a very obedient child. I was a very kind hearted, pure child, for the most part. Like when I say that, when I mean pure, I wasn't a wild child. I wasn't really a part of the world because my mother, well, both my parents, they were very overprotective. So I wasn't allowed to watch TV, listen to music, or anything like that growing up. But by the time I was 11, which is also the same time that I gave my heart to Christ,
Mm-hmm.
my parents were fully involved in the church, but like I said, they would use it against me. And how I mean that is, I think there's one particular incident. She says I backtalked her. I didn't really backtalk her, but anyway, she said that I backtalked her. So she stripped me naked, put me in front of the house, and made me recite all of Romans. I want to say it was chapter 1, over and over and over again for several hours. And we lived on a highway, so people saw me naked in front of
That
the
had
house.
to be very horrific.
That was very horrific. It was very humiliating,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the kind of punishment that I would have.
Was the
And
sexual abuse still going on at that point, or it had it ceased
that
at
no,
that point?
it actually was just beginning. It was just beginning. So around the age, I was almost 12. That's when my father started to sexually abuse me, and did up until the age of 14 when I finally left home. Now, prior to me leaving home, I would say within 6 months of me leaving the house, I ran away. I was being accused of being a Satanist, and I wasn't. I was very, very much devout to God.
Mm-hmm.
I was very active in the church. I was very obedient to my parents.
So what was the
And
basis for the accusations? Like, why was that happening, and what was the basis of it?
I truly believe that my half brother, and I really don't want to go too far into
No, no,
him, but
that's okay.
he was actually, or still is, I guess, a minister, but he is a minister of some kind of, I don't know, it's kind of cultish type of churches. And so if you do anything, it's automatically satanic. You wear a black
Mm,
t-shirt, you're satanic. It's very over the top, like very over the top. And he somehow
right.
convinced my parents that I was a Satanist. And again, I can tell you that was not true. So after being accused and accused and accused and accused of all these things, like I was being accused of having sex with boys, and I had never had sex with boys. The only person who had any sexual encounter with me was my dad at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I was being accused of being on drugs, never had a drug in my entire life outside of like cough syrup. So I was being accused of a lot of things, and I was getting beaten for it because I would deny doing anything, and then I was being called a liar, and so I'd be beaten for being a liar and that sort of thing. So finally, one day, I'm like, you know what? If I'm going to be accused of all this stuff, I might as well do it, or at least give the appearance of it. So that's kind of where it began for me. That's when I got into heavy metal. I'm talking about heavy metal, the stuff like Slayer, things that are obviously very satanic and demonic. But for me, it started with trying to put off that image. I actually gave an analogy to my husband. Do you remember in Greece when Sandy, she was that sweet little innocent
Yes.
girl, and then she just made this decision one day. Okay, well, I don't fit in, or I'm being
Right.
made fun of or accused of this or that, so I might as well just fit the image.
Right.
Okay, so it's kind of like that. I made a conscious decision that, all right, if I'm going to be accused of this stuff, then I might as well do it, but at least the appearance of it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of
Mm-hmm.
where it began for me as far as the occult. I will say it started with music. I did not have any taste in music because I wasn't allowed to listen to the radio. But at school or on the school bus, we had Walkmans and stuff back then. You know, students would bring stuff to school or whatever. And I would get to listen to music. And I had several friends, and they listened to the likes of, you know, Bon Jovi, Skid Row, and some were a little deeper. Some Slayer, some Apertura. I mean, there was a bunch of different bands out there back then.
So
And
how do
I would
you
get
feel the music impacted you that you're focusing on that? Like what was
it resonated. It
it
resonated with me.
resonated with your pain from the
Yes,
false accusations and the hurt and the woundedness?
yes. It was the I don't fit anywhere, but I feel accepted here. That I think that's what it was. And even with friends, I didn't have a whole lot of friends growing up because I wasn't allowed to do anything extracurricular. One of the things that I found though was I connected very well to the outcast, and
Mm.
I felt very accepted. So it didn't matter what I looked like, what I dressed like, or whatever. They say birds of a feather flock together. Eventually, you become a part of that bird, if that makes any sense.
It
If you
does.
if you start hanging around certain people who have a certain culture, you start to develop a lot of those habits and cultures. And that's kind of how I got into the heavy metal scene and started getting into rock. And eventually, as we'll discuss, eventually it went darker than that later on in my life.
I am grateful you decided to come walk a mile with me, your host, Maria Wingard, on the Bridging Broken to Breakthrough podcast for our Red Tent conversations. To find out how Jesus bridges broken to breakthrough and to listen to past episodes, please visit hopewillarise.com. And thanks for listening today.